Good morning, everyone. I'm Lindsay Newton, the Director of Community Engagement here at the Missouri Historical Society, and I want to thank you all for visiting or attending our virtual program, Our River Conversation, Valuing the River. This morning's program is inspired by our special exhibit, The Mighty Mississippi, which is presented by Bank of America. So I want to send a huge thank you out to Bank of America and also a heartfelt thank you to JSM Charitable Trust, the education sponsor for this exhibit, as well as Ward and Carol Klein, who sponsored the Our River series of programs. We also want to acknowledge our Missouri Historical Society members. I know many of you watching today are members, and your support makes so much of our work possible. And last, but certainly not least, we appreciate the support from the Zoo Museum Tax District. Safety is a top priority, and thus nearly all of our programming is virtual right now, but the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday with several safety precautions in place, and we would love for you to visit the Mighty Mississippi exhibit and the rest of the museum if you feel safe. Advanced reservations are required to visit all of the Missouri Historical Society locations, so please visit our website, mohistory.org, to plan your visit and reserve your free tickets. I will quickly mention just a few details about how today's program will run. This will be a roughly 30-minute presentation followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. You can submit questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar. Please know that we will do our best, but we may not have time to answer all of your questions. And today's presentation is being recorded. So if you'd like to view it again or share with others who maybe couldn't make it this morning, it will soon be posted on our MHS YouTube channel. Shortly after the presentation starts, I will post a link in the chat so that you can go to the YouTube channel. I encourage you to check out several other programs we've done in the past few months. Today's program is actually the third installment in the series of Our River Conversations, and you can find the first two on YouTube. Lastly, your feedback is always important to us. We would really appreciate if you could answer a few questions for us after the program. A Kobo Toolbox survey will soon open, or it might have already opened, in another tab on your browser, so just keep an eye out for that as you leave this session. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our wonderful guest presenters this morning. Derek Heffernan, Associate Professor of Architecture in the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University, as well as Olivia Dorothy, the Director of Upper Mississippi River Basin at American Rivers. Thank you both for being here this morning. Derek, I'm going to hand it off to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Missouri Historical Society. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. So again, my name is Derek Heffernan. I'm the Chair of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design Programs here at the Sam Fox School at WashU. And I'm going to present briefly my ongoing research project titled Way Beyond Bigness, the Need for a Watershed Architecture. That's the content of a forthcoming book that will be coming out next year. I also want to give a special thanks to my students at WashU and research assistants, particularly Jess Vanacek, Paul Wu, and Chin Yu Zhang, who have been instrumental in helping me draw up a lot of this work that you will see today. So first of all, some definitions to kind of set the stage. And I also want to say the photographs you're going to see in this background of this presentation are ones that I've taken over the course of many years documenting the Mississippi watershed. A watershed. So many of you probably on the Zoom today know this kind of definition, the classic definition of a watershed, an area or ridge of land that separates waters flowing to different rivers, basins, or seas. There's another version of that definition is something different that doesn't have to do with water. An event or period marking a turning point in a course of action or a state of affairs. So it's a tipping point, basically, like one that we're experiencing right now during the pandemic. Architecture, what I'm trained to do, I'm a licensed architect, and that's what my education was. So it makes me kind of question, what does it mean to be an architect in these larger scale challenges of river basin management. The classic definition is the art or practice of constructing and designing buildings. But a more recent definition of that term in recent years, and I think the word architecture gets loosely thrown around for better or for worse, a different definition is the complex or carefully designed structure of something. So again, that's a very vague definition for the word architecture, but it really opens up the way of thinking about the built environment or architecture in terms of relating to other systems. So Way Beyond Bigness prioritizes the understanding of two different things: the understanding of the larger scale effects that watersheds have for design decisions, specifically, how can designing with water integrate best with the built environment? And two, the inevitable yet resilient need to adapt to contemporary tipping point watershed events and times. It realigns watersheds and architecture across multiple scales, from the site to the river basin, multiple disciplines from ecologists to economists, multiple narratives from the hyperbolic to the realistic, and multiple venues from the academic to professional. So given our contemporary complex challenges, specifically in relation to water, I argue that current design research cannot be accomplished by one author, or for that matter, by one architect, a landscape architect, or urban designer, but it requires collaborations that go inside and outside our typical design disciplines, but definitions, and also break down our typical professional and academic dichotomies. It aspires for opportunities, not crises. It also is about being proactive and not reactive. It's about both downstream and upstream, and it's also about pragmatism and optimism. Way Beyond Bigness proposes a simple adaptive framework that utilizes an integrative design research methodology that I've structured in three different parts. One is, how do you appreciate conditions and then analyze them? How do you speculate then and synthesize? And then finally, how do you collaborate and catalyze? So the bulk of what I'll talk about today for the next few minutes is the appreciate and analyze section, or what I term as the need for transboundary understandings. So the Mississippi work is also understood in relation globally to other river basins. And I think this is important for us to be able to compare and learn from what is happening in other places. So it's the book and the work is about the Mississippi, the Mekong, and the Rhine river basins. And I kind of makes somewhat of maybe provocative statements about each one's current state of development. I could argue, or we could maybe say, that the Mississippi is maybe stagnating, still in a kind of 20th century mode of engineering, of river management, and trying to figure out what's next. The Mekong is rapidly accelerating. It's on an ambitious scale development of massive hydropower dams up and down the entire basin, which will radically transform the nature of it. And then the Rhine, you can say, for mostly better, but also sometimes worse, is adapting, changing its policies in terms of climate change and development within the Rhine, but also how it really relates to the environment and the economy of Europe. But first, taking a step back, and this is important for me as a designer because I'm not trained in kind of the aspects of policy or legal management, but who manages the river basin? So what you're going to see here is a series of diagrams and drawings that show trying to legibly and graphically very complicated large-scale conditions. And for this instance, who manages? We know the Mississippi is mostly, almost all of it, within the United States. The Mekong crosses multiple countries, some of which are more active with management, others which are not. And then the Rhine is really distinguishes itself as two different management structures, one which is very much about the environment and protection of it, and the other which is very much about the economic aspect of it. So what this drawing is, if you can see it, it's a lot of small text, but kind of the general idea is it's a flow chart where I'm trying to unravel the complicated management structure here of the Mississippi River Basin, which of course has a lot to do with the US Army Corps of Engineers, but that is also mandated by acts of Congress for anything that's done in terms of large-scale infrastructural changes along the Mississippi. So there's an implementation aspect of it and a legislative aspect of it. At the bottom, there's also feeding into this, of course, are very important NGOs and nonprofits and lobbyists that are really advocating for fundamental change of sustainably managing the river, such as places like American Rivers. These diagrams show an analysis of the territories that are in each one of the basins, the tributaries that are just as crucially important in terms of the watershed, not just the main stem, volumes of water. So this diagram of the Mississippi in the upper left shows really when the Missouri and especially the Ohio hit the main stem, when it truly becomes the mighty Mississippi in terms of flow. And then of course, topography. Where does the water come from and originate from the Rockies to Appalachia, for instance? So what I've done is, in terms of these three basins, this is an organization chart that attempts to show the different scales that I'm studying them. So it starts at the world, literally, how do you situate these river basins within the world? Then it goes to the continental scale, to the territorial scale, which is really about the sub-basins within the river basins, and then down to regional understandings. And then finally to the site scale, specifically looking at infrastructure of dams along these rivers. So for the Mississippi River Basin, of course, we know that it is so important on a global scale, particularly in terms of economic aspects for trade and industry, but also big agriculture and the transportation of goods throughout. And then in the continental analysis, it's about the Mississippi River Basin within North America. This photograph, some of you probably know that are here. This is at high water levels taken from the Chain of Rocks Bridge with the two water intake towers that were formerly used in the Mississippi. And then this drawing shows hopefully a different, probably some of you have seen this, but a clear, different understanding of how the basin is controlled. So what red indicates power, it indicates control. The little red dashes are stapled. The ones that look like staples are all the dams in the river basin. And then the red lines indicate levee protected areas. The greenish zone is agriculture. And then these boxes show the different scales of analysis that I've been doing. And correlating with these plans are a series of abstracted sectional drawings. Because really to understand the flow of water and the control of it, you have to understand it in the vertical dimension too. So what this drawing shows is a section from the source of the Mississippi, Lake Itasca, down through the cascading locks and dams in the upper Mississippi past St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico, but it also layers in both the front and the back, the other river basins, the other tributaries, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Tennessee. The next scale in is the territory, which is this is the Missouri River Basin. This is Gavin's Point Dam, which is one of the big 5 or big 6 dams, hydropower dams that are far upriver. And then this drawing shows a lot of red, a lot more red. And it's not just the red dams that are making their way down the river, but a whole kind of spider web network of all the transmission lines, many of which come from those dams for hydropower and make their way across the whole basin. As well, it shows other important things such as agriculture. It highlights out the tribal lands, the Native American reservations, underground aquifers, the Bakken Shale resources. So a heavily exploited resource landscape that is designed. And the section with that shows the large reservoirs that are behind each one of those dams. It indicates diagrammatically the power that's emanating from them. Above that is a classification and organization of each one of the lakes behind the dams. And then finally at the top are photographs that I've taken of those dams. So the Missouri really is about a landscape that's been inundated. The photograph in the upper right is the Standing Rock Reservation. This was the protest site for the Dakota Access Pipeline. It generates massive amounts of power. It's an extraction landscape. This is the Bakken Shale Formation. The color photograph is one of the temporary quote unquote man camps up in North Dakota. And of course, it's about releasing flood control, these huge spillways. So more specific to where we are, Territory 2 is the upper Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee basins. Again, a lot more red. This shows all the transmission lines, but this map shows the upper Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Tennessee together. And this section of that, this is upriver of St. Louis. So these are the 27 or so locks and dams that make navigation possible for the barges and Region 2, the confluences where we are of the Illinois, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers. So this is the bottom of the drawing is where we are virtually or literally in St. Louis, and then moving up into what we call the pools. So it shows the confluence of the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Illinois, and then the locks and dams. And then the reddish areas show the levee protected areas within the floodplains between the bluffs. And then photographs of those pools going through the locks and dams, and then also the diagram that shows not just the construction of them down to St. Louis, but also the type of goods that are going up and down, whether it's fertilizer or corn and soybean going back down river. And then finally, the last scale of that is is one of the locks and dams, which are all very similar to each other. This is Lock and Dam 25. And then at the site scale, you can see maybe the red dashed lines is the former width and path of the Mississippi. And then by creating these dams, how much wider these pools have become. And then the greenish areas both show forested and agriculture area and what's levee protected within the bluffs. So that what used to naturally flood became this kind of heavily mandated system. And the last drawing of this shows the operation of those locks when the barges come in, go up, and then out, and then photographs of what it's like to be in there. So this area we're in, we constrict it, we narrow it, we make it all about navigation. We have huge canals. This is the Chain of Rocks canals, both in high and low water level that bypasses north of St. Louis. It's a large production landscape. The upper photograph is of a fertilizer plant in Iowa. And then finally, of course, transportation, the huge, the highway, as we call it, the superhighway through the middle part of the country. And I'm going to briefly end on the last two categories. I won't go into depth about these, but the next thing as a designer, and this is also about collaborative interdisciplinary work as well, how do you speculate about the futures? Sometimes in a kind of hyperbolic way, but also to put out bolder ideas, and then how do you engage the community with those? So this is a project I did with a colleague of mine a few years ago, Ian Kane, and we were interested in looking at the continent and then the future projections of mega regions of the future. So the Chicago, Great Lakes area, Boston, and Washington. But a lot of those protections aren't based about environmental conditions such as water, strangely enough. So we came up with an alternate proposal, the bottom map, that says that the Midwest, the Mississippi, will be the hydro region of the future. This is where the water will be in the future. And there might be too much of it, it might be too polluted, but it's gonna be here. So the argument is like, why not be in these water-rich zones? And then finally, last two slides, the notion of collaboration, why we're all here, why you're all here, the need for transdisciplinary engagements. I worked on a project last year, it's still ongoing with my students here, as well as a group out of Germany, the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, who's been doing an ongoing project on the Mississippi River. And we literally worked on a barge on the Mississippi River. Our partner was Continental Cement Company, and they gave us access to their barge. We staged an event. We did an exhibition that was studying different aspects of the river. Here's some photographs of that heavily industrial site with the arch in the background. And then lastly, we moderated a panel. So I'm very interested in coming up with new literal platforms for engagement, in this case, a platform barge. And it brought together a whole wide array of interests in the Mississippi River, from economic interests to engineering, to environmental, to art, to cultural. And we had a wonderful discussion on the platform barge. So with that, I've gone a little bit over, but I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here today to hear a little bit about my research. So I'll stop share now and I'll hand it over to Olivia.
Thanks, Derek. All right, we're gonna jump into my presentation, and after I finish, I think we will be doing some Q&A. So feel free to plug your question into the chat window as soon as you think of it. All right, so good morning or afternoon, depending on which time zone you're calling or joining us from. My name is Olivia Dorothy. I'm the director of the Upper Mississippi River Basin at American Rivers, and I'm going to talk to you today about the value of a healthy Mississippi River. If you're not familiar with American Rivers, we're a national river conservation organization focused on protecting wild rivers, restoring damaged rivers, and conserving clean water for people and nature. Like I said, we're a national organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we have field staff in 11 priority river basins, including the Upper Mississippi River Basin, where I am joining you from in East Moline, Illinois. And if you don't know where that is, it is right here. So what is the value of the Mississippi River? Derek did a really great job highlighting what types of extractive industries are working along the Mississippi River, that we have developed the river and its corridor for agriculture, for transportation and manufacturing. And so what does that all mean in terms of economics? All right, so in terms of traditional economic valuation, we know that the Mississippi River generates about just over $400 billion annually in economic activity. And most of this is actually in manufacturing in terms of actual dollars generated. But if you look at the number of jobs, you'll see that about a third of the jobs that the Mississippi River supports is related to tourism. And so there is a lot, obviously, to do with tourism in terms of natural resources along the Mississippi River. People travel to the Mississippi River because it is beautiful, because it is one of the world's largest river systems and very iconic. And so when you look at this chart and you see how much of the economy around the Mississippi River is based on the exploitation of its resources through manufacturing, farming, mining, minerals, navigation, and just general resource harvesting, you know, it begs the question of what have we lost in terms of ecosystem services that the river has provided? What have we lost in terms of the environment? Because we know, obviously, that as we develop landscapes, we lose a lot on the environmental side. And this is a very traditional look at economics. So obviously, traditional economic development comes at a cost. What are those costs? The field of ecosystem services is a field of economics that tries to quantify in dollars and cents the value of different types of healthy ecosystems. And these valuations are kind of lumped into three general categories for the most part. Provisioning services like food and energy and fibers, regulating services that include things like pollution filtration, waste decomposition, waste removal, climate regulation, and then also cultural services like recreation, leisure, fun, aesthetic values. So we know from markets that these different services that ecosystems can provide, that you can put a dollar figure on these services. So American Rivers wanted to ask, what types of ecosystem services does the Mississippi River provide? And what types of services has the Mississippi lost through development? And so we did a contract with Earth Economics and published a report. You see it cited down at the bottom there. We published a report last year that looked at Pool 26 in the Mississippi River. And this pool is just above St. Louis. You can see my pointer here. This gray area, this is where St. Louis Metro, this is the Missouri River. This is the Mississippi River that's cutting down diagonally. And this is the Illinois River. And this area in orange right here that is, I'm circling, this is the pool that we decided to study. And we decided to study this pool, the stretch of the Mississippi River, because the lock and dam here was replaced in 1994. It was replaced with Mel Price Lock and Dam that replaced Lock and Dam 26. And when that lock and dam was constructed, it actually increased the size of this pool. And so we were able to look at different types of habitat that existed before Mel Price Lock and Dam was finished, and how that habitat changed after Mel Price Lock and Dam was completed. And we did this because we weren't really able to look all the way back at the landscape and habitat types that existed prior to the construction of the locks and dams. That goes back to the 1920s and 1930s, depending on where you are on the Mississippi River. And basically, the information that we have about the land uses and habitat types that existed along the river, that data is not in great shape, and it's really hard to compare it to the data that we have today about the different habitat types and exactly where they were along the Mississippi River. And so for the purposes of our study, because we didn't have a super large budget to dig back into that really old data, we decided to look at this more modern example of habitat conversion through the construction of this new dam on the Mississippi River. So you can see here on the screen, this is the different habitat types, and you might be looking at them and thinking like, oh, they look almost exactly the same, except maybe down here. But this is the actual breakdown of the different habitat types and how they changed over time with the construction of Mel Price Lock and Dam as it replaced Lock and Dam 26. And so you can see here that we had a 7% decline in woody wetlands. These are like the bottomland floodplain forest. We saw a decline in agricultural land. We did see a bit of an increase in herbaceous wetlands, but not a lot increase in prairie grasses. So what does this mean in terms of economic valuations? So woody wetlands we see are worth about $16,000 per acre per year. So annually, that's the valuation of them. Prairies, grasses, these are all wetland types that you might see in the floodplain. These are really the most valuable types of habitat because they support a number of services from flood conveyance to water purification. Whereas a lot of these other types of land uses just don't provide that same level, that same large suite of services. So even though it doesn't seem like there was a significant amount of changes in that pool, it was actually really stunning to see the loss, that relatively modest loss of woody wetlands really drove down the functionality of the habitat in that stretch of the Mississippi River when they constructed the new dam to replace Pool 26, Lock and Dam 26. Also, significant declines caused by the conversion of wetlands to other forms of development. So when this added together, all this added together, and this is really being driven by the loss of floodplain forest habitat, there is over this period of time from 1989 to 2011, we saw ecosystem services loss of $23 to $29 million. And even though the cost of Mel Price Lock and Dam, this seems really trivial because that Mel Price Lock and Dam cost, I think it was over $2 billion. This does equal about 10% of the current operations and maintenance costs at Mel Price. So this is a pretty significant loss in ecosystem services from the construction of this one project. And again, this isn't even comparing what the construction of this dam was compared to what existed in the Mississippi River corridor historically. It's just what existed previous to the construction of this dam. So how is this relevant to the valuation of the Mississippi River writ large? So when we look at the Mississippi River corridor, and Derek did a really great job of describing what exists throughout the Mississippi River corridor today in terms of agricultural development, the construction of levees, as well as urban and commercial and manufacturing development. So the Mississippi River Corridor is a very developed landscape. And so when we look at those land uses, based on this study, we know that those land uses, range, those land uses are not particularly valuable in terms of the ecosystem services. And so in order to maximize the river's economic potential, we need to focus on converting parts of the river's corridor back to those natural floodplain ecosystems that included prairies, marshes, and forests, and those different wetland types to maximize the impact and the value of the river in terms of the services that it could provide us. So, the reason why those floodplain ecosystem types are so very valuable is that they provide so many services for people. Flood risk reduction through flood conveyance away from people and critical infrastructure. These floodplain habitats tend to be zones where the river can recharge groundwater supplies, which can prevent or guard against drought, future drought conditions, which we know are happening more and more with climate change. They provide valuable wildlife habitat for game, fishing game, as well as habitats for threatened and endangered species. Wetlands that exist on floodplains are really effective at filtering water pollution out of the river's water column. And then there's just a host of other quality of life benefits that include improvements to air quality for local communities, as well as just providing a natural area where people can go out and enjoy, get exercise, and those types of activities can lead to overall health benefits for people. A lot of times when we try to present this information to communities to incorporate ecosystem restoration into various riverfront and floodplain development projects, we get a lot of pushback from communities because when you restore areas of land, especially in cities and towns, you lose that tax base. People aren't able to develop and build commercial and residential properties that can pay property taxes into local coffers. And so in response to that, we know that at American Rivers, we knew that that wasn't the whole picture because we've done restoration projects, floodplain restoration projects all over the country, and really seeing communities build around these projects in a way that benefits them economically. And so we dove into some of these projects and documented the various economic benefits that these floodplain reconnection and restoration projects provided. And what we saw was that there was significant returns on investment. There were significant reductions in things like flood damage, again, because having these areas open to the river can help convey floodwaters away from residents and people. Property tax values in the lands adjoining these restoration sites oftentimes increased. And people just invested more, businesses invested more because people want to live and work in areas that are aesthetically pleasing, again, for those quality of life outcomes. So even though doing these projects can reduce property tax revenues, there can be an overall net benefit in terms of jobs, financial savings, and other types of investments. So obviously, like I said, it is proven that investing in natural infrastructure and improving those ecosystem services, like along the Mississippi River, creates jobs. Like any other capital investment, you are going to create construction jobs. Their jobs will be created around recreation and maintenance of those sites, as well as improvements to water quality that can drive savings for communities down the road. So for this reason, American Rivers, down here at the bottom, you can go to this website and we're calling on Congress to invest $500 billion over 10 years as part of an economic recovery package for the United States. And as part of that package, we are promoting the inclusion of $200 billion in modern floodplain development that would both meet the needs of communities that live along rivers, as well as improving those ecosystem services that can drive a lot of economic benefits for the nation and for the communities. And with that, I will wrap things up, and I think that we can answer some questions.
Thank you both. So yes, our audience has been firing away several questions already. To start with, this is kind of a long question. I know, Derek, you've already read it.
Yeah.
But someone has just pointed out that, Derek, your conceptualization of the river system is marvelous. It is based, however, on a mechanical view, usually focused on domination of the river, geographical, physical.
But I like geographical.
Physical manipulations, power distribution. And so it remains locked into an anthropocentric view. Can you imagine or help direct to a perspective that maybe accounts just as well for the biology that is impacted by the degradations of the human community, or more positively, how these diverse environmental conditions can be restored and preserved?
Sure. No, and like I said, that's a great question, and it's something that I don't want to just because I showed all those drawings of control. It's meant to be objective. It's meant to be, this is what it is, and then part of what we do as designers is those drawings obviously are latent with other interpretations and become political. I mean, everything we draw and make becomes a kind of hopefully a statement. So my goal with those, I mean, I have my points of views on them. Look, I very much am in tune with what Olivia and others are saying, and I think that's the future sustainability of an adaptive system for the Mississippi. But I think we also have to draw out as bluntly and boldly as possible that relentless dominated condition of the Mississippi. And part of this is also who's the audience. A lot of my audience is also teaching to design students, so they understand this. Just like it's not a Harold Fisk map of the Mississippi River. It's a much more controlled system. But to your question about ecological or biological alternatives, yes, I mean that's what the speculative and engagement aspect of my project, which I briefly alluded to. But it's starting to think, we're not going to change the system, and we're not going to get rid of industry. We're not going to get rid of agriculture in the future, obviously, in the Mississippi. But what if we could start to think much more ecologically about the future of jobs, the future of industry? Less reliance on monoculture, obviously, would be a good thing. But how do you balance that with things that like models that Olivia is talking about, whether it's ecosystem restoration services, or whether it's just a completely transformative way of thinking 50, 100 years down the line. So that's, I don't want it to come across that I'm just trying to say that it's anthropogenic and that's the way it is forever. It's like you need that kind of objective view to be able to change. That was long-winded, sorry, but just want to help to clarify.
Quite all right. There's so much to talk about in this dialogue, right? Olivia, someone has asked, what do you need to measure along freshwater biomes that enhance our view of the life on the river? In other words, what is missing in the data set that helps us understand the wellness of the Mississippi River?
Yeah, so this is pretty tricky to answer because we have a lot of data on the upper Mississippi River, which has the long-term resources monitoring. program that's part of the Upper Mississippi River Restoration Program. And that has been really helpful in measuring the wellness of the river. Although unfortunately, they were able to conclude in their last report in 2016 that the river is actually still in a state of decline. And so even with the restoration efforts that have been underway since the mid-1980s, the river is still losing habitat faster than restoration efforts can basically rebuild it or rehabilitate habitat along the upper Mississippi. So this is a really significant finding, which means that we need to be investing a lot more in restoring habitat types, because what we've really done on the upper Mississippi River is turn the river into a series of pools. So it's not really a free-flowing river anymore. And so the effort and resources and investment it takes to try to maintain the upper Mississippi River as a river ecosystem is, the needs are virtually unlimited, because it's not, we've changed it so it's not really a river anymore with the dams. And so, in terms of data needs, we really need to be looking, this ecosystem services model is really important. I saw that there's another question in the chat window about how ecosystem services are calculated and how that's applied within the federal decision-making context. And the issue is that the Corps of Engineers has not adopted sort of a standard ecosystem services model for to incorporate in their cost benefit analysis. And this has been really problematic. And they are, even though they have been directed by administrations to incorporate ecosystem services into the decision-making model, the cost benefit model, it has not really been done in any type of systemic way. There are other agencies, including FEMA, and I think the USDA, which have also, they have incorporated, all of the federal agencies have been directed to incorporate ecosystem services into decision-making. FEMA is probably the one that is in the lead in terms of using those types of models to make decisions, but a lot of work needs to be done. And again, the Corps of Engineers is probably in last place in terms of incorporating ecosystem services into their benefit cost ratios. In my experience, I found that if we do the ecosystem services valuation for the Corps, they will oftentimes incorporate it into their decision-making framework, but they usually don't. It's not a place where they start from, unfortunately.
Thank you. Another question for both of you. Someone is asking, do you have priority areas where the ecosystem restoration would be considered ready or essential for the overall well-being of the freshwater biome?
That's a good question. I mean, Olivia, is that a practical question or a visionary one? I don't, like, what we need more, do we need more, if you take the lower Mississippi from Cairo down to New Orleans, there's a series of spillways and floodways that are already part of that system, that engineered system, but it's not many. We have the New Madrid floodway, which is literally at the beginning of the lower Mississippi, and it's only utilized during crisis events, right? Like they literally have to blow up the Birds Point levee to release water to save other areas. And then there's the Bonnet Carré spillway, there's Old River Control and Morganza. But, there's chatter about there, do we need more? Do we need not necessarily engineered spillways, but do we need more space that could open up? And I think that's more on the visionary longer view end of it, right? Like, is there a whole new system of openings that are pulse, you can pulse them, you can adapt them. They could be part of a nationwide national park network or something, right? And but those take acts of Congress, right? So that's a question. It goes back to the Corps of Engineers, and so if you start to think about those, or is it working with like upriver? I when up with a colleague of mine, Chuck Tiling, who works with the Corps of Engineers, and he's been working with local farmers, smaller scale farmers, people that own like 100 and 200 acre plots of land, not big scale, that are restoring parts of these pools and finding critical moments where they can move the water around and reintroduce wetlands into it. So it's like, where do you want to pick your battle in terms of doing something on a small scale, which is still a big wetland backwater, but when do you need to think about all those connecting into a much larger network?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good answer. You know, we can't just look at the Mississippi River itself. We do need to look at the Mississippi River in the context of its bigger watershed and look for opportunities throughout the watershed, because what you can do up in the tributaries is going to benefit the Mississippi River as well. There are conversations about the need to open up more of the floodplain to give the river, the Mississippi River, a little more room to roam. There are numerous constriction points along the river. For example, near Hannibal, Missouri, there's a very significant river constriction point that causes the Mississippi at flood stage to back up all the way up past Keokuk, Iowa. Actually, the Mississippi River backs up because of constriction due to levees. So there are definitely high priority sites that can where we should be focusing some of these river reconnection and restoration efforts to move levees back and basically just give the river a little more space, especially with climate change coming. We know that we're seeing bigger and bigger rain events, which is causing more and more flooding and longer duration flooding too, which when you have a longer duration flood, that is a very different type of flood, type of flood event for emergency managers, because a lot of our temporary flood structures and even our levees, they the longer that they are wet, the longer they have water on them, the weaker they become. And so, you know, the temporary flood fighting measures that we've always relied on in the past may not work well for us in the future. So we need to be asking some big questions about how do we give our rivers a little bit more room to improve public safety. And again, you know, once we give that river some room to move around, how can we maximize the economic potential of the river and its floodplain?
Thank you. We are running up against the clock here, but I'll ask one more question from our audience, and sort of along those lines of talking about areas that are ready, or would it be ideal? And someone else is asking, sort of, you know, the Mississippi River is too economically important to ever be fully restored. But is anyone looking at what a compromise might look like? Are there potential wetlands, floodplain restorations, habitat restorations, et cetera, that can be developed without excessive economic impact? So trying to balance that, taking care of nature and taking care of our economy.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can start by saying, you know, we really need to be looking at incorporating ecosystem service valuation into our decision-making models for all different types of development along the Mississippi River, as well as in the tributaries, so that we can see these points where it would be potentially more economically valuable to restore the historic ecosystem or rehabilitate the historic ecosystem instead of continuing to maintain it in an altered state. So these types of activities can range from removal of dams in the tributaries as well as on the main stem. You know, there are 2 dams on the Mississippi River main stem that are no longer being used for navigation in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, St. Paul. And they are drowning a very unique type of ecosystem, a big floodplain rapids ecosystem in the Mississippi River Gorge below St. Anthony Falls. You know, and it could be very economically valuable from an ecosystem services standpoint to remove those dams and restore that type of river habitat that's been almost completely lost from the river through the construction of the dams. And then there are a lot of dams in the tributaries that can be removed, and levees can be set back and altered in ways that to improve, like I mentioned in my slide, to maximize some of those ecosystem services values while also being community assets. And those need to be looked at. Cropland farm production, as I mentioned, is not necessarily the most economically beneficial use of a floodplain. And I know that impacts individual families significantly, and there needs to be mechanisms to make sure people are whole at the end of it. But in the bigger picture of things from a national and community economic perspective, we need to be looking at how to potentially take some of that land out of production and give it back to the river, so to speak. Derek, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Okay, yeah, we have a little bit more time, Lindsay, just to answer? Yeah. I mean, I think, again, that's the big elephant in the room question. And, some of you may know Colin Wellenkamp, who does the Missouri River Cities and Towns Initiative. And he was on that panel we had on the barge last year. And, he said this, he's like, we're going to have a coming to Jesus moment with the Mississippi River Basin. Like the fact that in 2019, how many consecutive days was the river shut down because of the floods, right? How much more can this existing system handle the extremes of climate that are being hit at it? How sustainable is monoculture and corn and soybean for the future? How can the barge industry sustain itself with these economic stresses? Politically, we're in a situation where we're at a stalemate about the future of this management system. So this 21st century version of the Mississippi River cannot continue to sustain itself as it did in the past. And I think we have to come to a collective understanding of that. And I think there are people out there on a smaller scale that are private landowners, whether it's the farmer I mentioned, or whether it's my friend up in the Missouri River, who are buying up larger tracts of land and starting to do this stuff on their own. And I think the more of that collective will that starts to bubble up, and the work of like American Rivers and other advocacy groups and my students and the new generation of kids that we're bringing up to become river citizens, that's going to do it, right? That's the political will right there. And that's what this exhibit's about. That's what this effort's about. So we have to be, and this is meant to be optimistic. This is not meant to be like, it's all gonna fall apart, but we're gonna have to change it.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing all of that valuable insight and so much about the work that you do. And thank you for doing that work. I'm going to share my screen just one more time, a couple slides to end our session today. I again just want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Bank of America, JSN Charitable Trust, and Ford and Carol Klein. And again, if you have a chance to come visit the Mighty Mississippi, we would love to have you if it's safe for you to come out and visit the museum. And last but not least, we do several programs online right here anytime. You can watch them on YouTube. I just posted that link in the chat, so you can head there. Today's presentation will go up by the end of the week. And join us next time. We've got a program this Thursday night about Mill Creek. And also I'll point out Sunday, October 18th is the next episode of this Our River Conversation series, the fourth one, called Honoring the Great Rivers. So we would love to have you join us that day. Again, thank you all for tuning in. Derek and Olivia, thank you for your knowledge you're sharing with us today. We will see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.